The regular meeting of the Charter Commission's Even Year Elections Work Group will now begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Barry Clegg, and along with Commissioner Jan Sandberg, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Charter Commission's Even Year Elections Work Group. Welcome to this meeting of this virtual meeting. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021, due to the declared local health pandemic. The city will be recording and posting this meeting to the city's website and YouTube channel as a means of increasing public access and transparency. This meeting is public and subject to the Minnesota Open Meeting Law. I'll now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so that we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Ginder.
Present.
Commissioner Kozak.
Present.
Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Co-chair Sandberg.
Present.
And co-chair Clegg.
Here.
There are 6 members present.
We have a quorum. We'll now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. So, Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt?
Motion Sandberg.
Kozak.
Second, Smith.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion or proposed amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Kozak.
Aye.
Commissioner Perry.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Co-chair Sandberg.
Aye.
And co-chair Clegg.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
That motion passes and we have an agenda. Next is the chair's report. The first item on my report is to appoint Commissioner Hawkins to this work group at her request. So welcome, Commissioner Hawkins, and we'll ratify that appointment at our next regular Charter Commission meeting. Second, I just wanted to say a few words. We're going to hear a presentation today from our elections division, but before we get to that, a few words about how we got here. We started looking at whether or not to consider even year elections in 2017. At the time, we were told, well, you can't do that because you can't have more than a one-page ballot, and it's impossible to do a ranked choice voting election and a conventional election on the same ballot. So we put it on the shelf. And then Hennepin County did one. The 2020 primary election for the state was at the same time as the special election for the city, in which Councilmember Osmond was elected. So it is possible after all. So we're back today to take another look at it. And there's really 2 threshold questions to this analysis in my view. Question number 1 is it legal? Can we do it? And question number 2 is, do the policy reasons favor doing it, assuming we can do it? Obviously, we've got to answer question number 1 before we get to question number 2, although I think we can go down both tracks at the same time. I also want to give, before we get to the end, everybody their homework for the next meeting. For commissioners, go to the LIMS file from 2017 and look at the documents in that file. There were several scholarly articles on the wisdom of changing from odd year to even year elections, and an opinion written by City Attorney Carol Bashoon. Carol, your homework is to go back and look at your own opinion from 2017 and take another look at it and see if it needs a refresh. And I would also like staff to think about how we might reach out and engage with Hennepin County and the Secretary of State, again, to get to the answer to number 1. Is there a way we can do this? So I'll proceed to item number 4 on the agenda, which is hearing a staff presentation from the Minneapolis Elections Division. I understand we're going to hear from Ray Dean, Jeff Narbrook, and Aaron Grossman. I know Tim Schwartz is here too. I don't know if he's part of the presentation or not. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and take it away?
Raymond Dean here. I'm a project coordinator in the city clerk's office. And I think that Jeff and Aaron, do you guys want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Jeff Narabrook. I'm one of the election administrators.
Good afternoon, working group. I'm Aaron Grossman, also an election administrator with Minneapolis. Thanks for having us.
And I know we have Tim Schwartz on the line and John Martin, and I think Karen Scheel, a couple other of our team members. As things stand now, Ray's going to lead the discussion, and then Aaron and I will jump in as needed.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, Co-Chair Clegg and Co-Chair Sandberg. Happy to present to you today some of the issues on even year elections that we've come up with. And as mentioned, we have several of other individuals associated with elections and voter services that should be able to answer most of your questions. I'm not so sure we'll have answers to 100%, but we'll do our best. We're going to be presenting on the issues for consideration of moving out the current municipal elections from off years to an even year election cycle. We put together a PowerPoint based on previous analysis and inquiries. We've had some outreach to Hennepin County Elections Office, as well as the Secretary of State's office. I'll be starting with the roles of the Charter Commission and go all the way to voters and election services and what that will do. We'll then present sort of on previous voter turnout and what might actually an actual shift might look like, and conclude with the next steps that also look at a timeline should amendment change be proposed for 2022 ballot. And of course, if you guys have any questions, you should feel free asking during the presentation, or if you'd like, just hold your questions to the end and we'll do our best. So the first slide talks about sort of the Charter Commission's role and this working group. Ultimately, there would be the presentation to the City Council should this move forward, and they would approve the ballot language to be placed on the November ballot. Then the mayor would have the option to accept or veto the proposed language. And then the voters' role would be to approve with a 51% yes votes on all those who voted on the question. And then it would be up to elections and voter services, sort of to create what that implementation might look like. Next slide. So why to make the shift? Some of the topics that have been discussed previously is possible increase of voter turnout for municipal election offices, possible cost savings. We'd have one less election in a 4-year cycle in Minneapolis, and that might possibly relieve some of the voter fatigue that some folks often talk about. Next slide. So the implications of shifting to even years. Of course, there's the legal implications, and currently a 2-page ballot wouldn't be allowed under state requirements, along with the orders of offices, and those two pretty much go together. If municipal RCV races could be approved for 2nd-page ballot, it would require 2 different optical scan voting systems. And my understanding, there's current legislation that's been introduced in the House that would allow that, but there's no companion bill in the Senate. There's a possibility of authorization for the Secretary of State for experimental use. And some of the other concerns would be ADA ballot difficulties that might come into play. And the changes in state law right now would be fairly difficult given the current political landscape at the Capitol. And should we move forward in the current state of law, of course, we would need to defend or survive any legal challenges that are likely to be filed. Next question.
Excuse me, Mr. Dean, could you
Yes.
talk a little bit about the possibility of authorization from the Secretary of State for experimental use?
There's a provision within state statute that allows the Secretary of State to do things around elections for experimental use. Of course, I'm not 100% sure that he could, put forward what we are proposing or what we might propose as an experimental use, but there is provision within state statute that allows that.
Thank you.
Yep. And next slide. Other implications shifting to even years, there's some logistic considerations, of course, as I'd mentioned, the size of the ballot, the questions of using multiple page ballots, and those would then be tied to the office order listings on the ballot. Current law only allows for judicial races to be on a second ballot or a second card. And then there would be some logistical issues around storage and ballot vaults should we have 2 cards for that. There's some personnel impacts that might arise, and that would be staff retention with no off-year election and issues related to election judge and student election judges be participating in our elections as well. Next ballot or next slide. Technologically, we're currently unable to mix a column ballot with a grid ballot. So that's the difference between standard election ballot and grid style ballot being ranked choice in the event that we might have 4 or 5 different ranked choice races on a single ballot. There are limitations of using the optical scan voting system, which state law currently says you can only use 1 ballot. There would be issues around USB storage of the data. As mentioned, the state regulation on ballot size won't really allow for a larger ballot. And then, of course, the reconciliation that takes place would not be possible if voters did not submit the second card to be tabulated. There's other absentee ballot issues. The increased number of absentee ballots in even year election would lead to more staff and machines needed for quick counting and a need for, of course, more storage space. Concerns around an absentee ballot for a 2-page ballot would be added mailing costs due to increased weight, large number of absentee ballots in even year election, whereas currently we have sort of X number of absentee ballots that get requested during an odd year election, that number would increase incredibly or drastically in an even year election. And that would also then have to include more complicated instructions and likelihood of mistakes on absentee ballots. Next question, or next slide. Voter drop-off for down ballot races could range from 5 to 25%, and there's lots of different evidences of happening in different types of races on election ballots in presidential versus midterm year elections. The CVR on election night would be delayed and for reporting and possible delays and result for municipal elections. And again, the 2 ballot cards are likely to cause some level of confusion for voters. There are also then issues that relate to campaign and candidates. Messaging through a larger slate of candidates would be difficult for municipal offices, and it's possible that the focus would shift from local issues to national and state offices, and this, of course, could disadvantage local elections. There would be likely shortage of campaign staff for local races, given that these races would occur at the same time as our statewide and our national elections would be taking place. And then you couple that with less donor dollars making it into municipal races, given that, and possible increase in campaign expenses because of the demands of all the elections. Next slide. So we did a quick little analysis of past even year elections versus odd year voter turnout. You can see in even year elections, in presidential elections, ranging from just under 79% to over 81%. And on midterm elections, ranging from roughly 55.5% up to 75.7%. Now, in our odd year elections during this RCV period, you see we range from just under 20% in 2009 to over 50% in 2021. And next slide, you'll see it in the graph. And we've seen a sort of a pretty standard increase in municipal elections over the past several elections. And presidential years don't have a lot of variation. And in 2018, in a midterm election, we saw a significant turnout, whereas the previous two midterms were, just over 55%. Next slide. And here's what the timelines for shifting to our elections to coincide with even year elections. If we shift to presidential election terms, doing both the city council and the mayor at the same time, we could make a shift a 3-year term to align with the even year elections, or we could do a 5-year term that would then align with midterm elections. State law allows us to move 1 year either way in regards to that. And you'll notice when you look at the council, we have the 2-year terms that would focus around redistricting that would take place. Next slide. And then this slide is actually a shift of city council and mayor elections so that they don't coincide, they would alternate. And again, looking at the shifting of the council during presidential years and the mayor during midterms, and then the council during midterms and the mayor during presidential. Next slide. So the next steps would have the working group recommendations to the full charter commission by May 4th. So that with the goals being able to meet the requirements and notify voters of possible shift to appear on that November ballot. The Charter Commission would then require a public hearing on the proposed charter change on June 1st. And then the Charter Commission consideration regarding moving forward or shelving the consideration at the time would have to take place on July 13th. That date to recommend the charter change to the council would need to occur July 21st. And then the deadline for the city council to adopt ballot language would be August 4th. And the reason that we have it August 4th is the opportunity, should the mayor decide to veto, of actually reworking language, and looking forward at that again. And I believe that is the last slide. So
Yes.
We'll take any questions you have at this time.
I have a couple, and then we'll see if anybody else does, put your name in the chat. But first, how did they do it when Councilmember Osmond was elected in a special election? That coincided with a state primary.
I can feel that. What made that possible was it was only one race. The size of the ballot was able to stay small versus the 4 or 5 races that we usually do on a municipal election. Is that, do I have that correct, Jeff or Aaron?
Yes, that's correct. And we asked Hennepin County to mock up some ballots so you could see some visuals. Ranked choice voting races take up a very large amount of real estate, and Ray is right that it was, if you have one race, you can probably fit it on an even year ballot, and if you have the full slate, you wouldn't.
There are other states now that have ranked choice voting, and many municipalities that do. Do you have any knowledge as to how they conduct those races? Do they use two separate pages for their ballot?
I do not have that knowledge. Aaron, Jeff?
Yes, I can jump in here. Thanks, Co-Chair Clegg. We did look at some other cities. Most cities that are doing ranked choice voting at this point are in the odd years, but there are a few, like I believe Oakland is in even years. And yes, they generally would have multiple ballot cards in other states where it's more regular and allowed. To your question, and as far as I know, there isn't. I'm not sure how it looks in a state where it's mixing both ranked choice elections and more conventional elections. Of course, we have the one example, like you've mentioned, from 2020 for us.
Isn't Maine, for example, ranked choice statewide?
Yes, they do have.
So they still need to do a primary election for federal seats, for congressional seats.
Right. So both Maine and now Alaska have ranked choice at the state level for kind of in a different format. The way that they've gone about it is a little bit different, and I think the number of races, it would be good to look at exactly how they're doing it.
And one more from me, and that is, can somebody in the elections office look into what would be involved to talk to the Secretary of State about a experimental permission to use a two-page ballot?
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, if I could just jump in, should we get approval of that? It might also mean that we would need to increase the number of scanners in order to capture those votes on election night as well. So there would also be a substantial financial implication.
I understand. Right now, I'm just focused on the technical. Is it possible? And there's a few questions in the chat. One from Co-Chair Sandberg.
Thank you. Okay, I see that the deadline to the city council is August 4th for the council to adopt a language. But would we then be sending it to them on the 13th? I'm worried about the gap to make things go through council cycles. I think we've had some experience where it could be longer than we originally anticipate. So is that our real deadline for our decision making, even though technically it's the 21st?
Co-Chair Sandberg, it actually would be the 21st because that's the beginning of the cycle. And August 4th is the date by which they would have to adopt the ballot language.
Tight. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ginder, you have your hand up.
Thank you. I just had a couple of comments, and one of them is about the two-step process that the chair mentioned at the beginning of the questions. Is it legal, and are there policy reasons to go forward with it? And I think a third one actually is, what's an appropriate time frame to discuss this? Because as I look at this, the complexities of the issue, the legal issues alone, seem to me to push this thing past this year's coming election. And because we're at the end of March now, and to get this back to the full Charter Commission with all these answers, I think it is going to be a real challenge. Second, I would note, as the chair talked about assignments for the commissioners, I would also urge people to take a look at the model charter that Commissioner Smith provided us from the National Civic League. That charter, proposed model charter this year for the first time, proposes that all municipal elections be held in odd years. It's been silent on that previously, and it talks about the two main reasons, some of which were touched on during the presentation here. One is which is they believe increasing partisanship will make it more difficult for allegedly nonpartisan municipal elections to avoid the larger federal and state noise. And second is that, which was touched on here, is that it will be much harder for people to be involved in and follow a municipal election when most of the light and heat will be focused on the federal and state elections. I thought that was interesting from the national group that took a stance on this newest charter to move to, or to suggest that people stay with an odd year election. So I'm just throwing that out. People can, the committee comments discuss it. It's very brief, but people might want to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Smith, you have a question.
Yeah, I just had a question. I was wondering what charter provision are we actually looking at amending? Where is it in the charter? I know there's a reference in section 3.2A to election years and in section 4.2, but I don't see anything specifically
references to it where it refers to elections, and it says elections will be held in the year after a year divisible by 4.
Okay.
That basically means an odd year after a presidential year.
Okay. Yeah, that's in 4.2B.
I think it's also on the park board section, but.
All right.
Commissioner Kozak, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, more of an observation. Given the presentation and the fact that right now, it seems to me that what we're trying to suggest here, or we're contemplating, is probably illegal, as Commissioner Gitter pointed out. But I understand there's an exception for experiments. But given the tight time frame that was outlined here, if we're going to go to the Secretary of State and find out what is permissible and how far we can push the envelope on an experiment, we better get cracking, because the first bunch that has to take a look at that and will define what the parameters are, it's going to be the Attorney General. And with all due respect to our lawyer friends who are on the call, that's going to take a bit. So if we're going to do anything and give the full commission, a full analysis of all the details here, we better find out how far we can go, and that means with the Secretary of State. So I think if we're going to do that, we got to get moving. We don't have much time.
Well, I hope I can pull us back a little, because I wasn't necessarily suggesting we consider this with a goal to this year. Okay. I was just considering it. I don't think we'd want to do it in a municipal only year. I think we'd want to do it in a general statewide election year. But I recognize there's probably a lot more work to do than we can do between now and July. But that's fine. I just don't want this to get lost again. I want us to keep working on it. And whether that's working with the Secretary of State to get experimental permission to proceed, whether it's figuring out a technical solution with Hennepin County so we can fit it on one page, or some other solution, or working with the legislature even to change the law. It's really an anti-ranked choice vote statute right now. Did anybody else have a question? I will work with Co-Chair Sandberg to set a time for our next meeting. And Co-Chair Sandberg and I are going to alternate chairing meetings. So she will chair the next meeting, and we will send out a time in the next few days. I think we would like to plan for one the week of the next Charter Commission meeting. So first week in April. Anything further for this evening? Hearing none and without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.